Hey, CW Bio, Mr. Kennedy here. Time for our next lecture in biology. This is the lecture on the common characteristics of life. So last time we talked, we were talking about what life is. So today we're going to dive into what does it mean to be alive, not just what are the different sizes or forms of life, but what does it mean to actually be alive. In our last lecture, we talked about life being everything from, big plants and trees and animals that you can see, all the way down to small stuff like bacteria, microorganisms that we don't necessarily think about. So today we're going to dive into a set of rules or set of characteristics that every living thing has in common. You can think of it like a test, but this is a test where if you miss one, you're completely kicked out. You completely fail. Characteristics of life, you have to have every one of these characteristics in order to be considered alive. If you're missing just one, no longer considered alive. So we're going to start with the definition. Definition of characteristics of life is that these are the things that all living organisms have in common. So let's dive into that list. First thing, all living things are composed of both organic and inorganic compounds. So if you're organic, then you've got carbon as a backbone in terms of the molecule. If you're inorganic, you do not. So here's some examples for you. Let me go through some of these. All right, carbohydrates. Carbohydrates are an example of an organic compound. They have carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen in their molecular structure, and they're primarily used for energy. You'll learn more about these organic compounds like carbohydrates when we get into organic chemistry in a later chapter. Okay, proteins, they're organic compounds. Carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, sulfur, all part of those molecules. Notice again, I call them organic, and the first atom on the list that makes these organic compounds up is carbon. Next one, fats, composed of carbon, hydrogen, oxygen. Fats are good for long-term energy storage and insulation. Definitely something that all living things have to have. Nucleic acid, DNA and RNA, found in all living things, right? Carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, phosphorus, nitrogen, those are the atoms that make up nucleic acids. All right, next thing, all living things, they use energy. Energy is this magical thing that gives us the ability to do work, right? All living things have to metabolize food that they take in or some energy source that they take in the form of an organic compound, and they use that to get energy that they need in order to do the work that we would consider life. In humans, the majority of the energy that we take in is actually lost in the form of heat. Up to 60% of that energy is lost in the form of heat. All right, next thing that we're going to talk about, all living things move. Okay, that movement could be something that is very obvious, could be something that's not so obvious, could be something that happens every day of their lives, could be something that happens only once in a while or even one life stage. But all living things have to move in some way, shape, or form in some part of their life. Next, all living things are highly organized. Okay, so what does it mean to be highly organized? If your backpack is a mess, if your room is a mess, are you not alive? That's not what it means. Living things being organized means that you are made up of a collection or a set of tiers of things, starting with actually atoms and molecules, moving up to cells, tissues, organs, organ systems, and then the entire organism. Okay, so that's what it means to be organized. So if you have a messy backpack, no, that doesn't mean that you are not alive. Okay, moving on to the next one, right? Just taking you through these things. All living things maintain balance. Okay, so if you can't walk 10 feet on the balance beam, does that mean you're not alive? Absolutely not. All living things maintain balance. That simply means homeostasis. It's a big word that we use in biology to describe balance, but think about your body temperature. Your body temperature is 98.6 degrees all the time. So if you go outside on a hot sunny day, right, it could be 110 outside. Your body temperature is going to be 98.6 degrees. If you go outside on a cold day in Fresno is what? 80? Okay, so then your body temperature is still going to be 98.6 degrees. That's balance. You're holding that body temperature no matter what. So homeostasis or balance is the process of maintaining a constant internal environment despite whatever goes on outside of your body. And I even put in an example here in these notes for you of your air conditioner. Air conditioner in your home, a lot like your body. You set the thermostat on the wall for a fixed temperature. If it gets too hot in your house, your air conditioner comes on. If it gets too cold in your house, your heater comes on. Your body temperature works the same way as your air conditioner. That thermostat on the wall is maintaining homeostasis in your house. Okay, next thing. All living things reproduce, or they have to make more of their own kind. There's two ways to reproduce. It could be sexual or asexual. Asexual reproduction only involves one parent. Basically, the offspring that you get from that single parent is ultimately a clone of that parent. It's very easy to reproduce this way. You can make lots of offspring this way. The really, really bad thing, though, is all the offspring are clones of the parent. That means all the way down to their DNA and their genetics. So if there's something that makes one of those offspring sick, it's going to make all of the offspring sick, right? That's bad. Sexual reproduction involves two parents. Because there's two parents combining their genetic information to make those offspring, the offspring's DNA is a little bit different than the parents. The offspring will look different than the parents. And remember what I said about asexual reproduction? That doesn't happen with individuals of sexual reproduction. If something makes one of you sick, it's not necessarily going to make all of you sick, because you'll have genetic variation that can help prevent that illness from affecting everybody. Next thing, all living things grow or they get larger. There's one of two ways you can grow. Okay, you can either grow by cell enlargement or by cell division. In a human, you kind of do both. Your cells start off, they get a little bit bigger and bigger. Once they reach the limit of the cell size that they can get to before they pop, they'll divide. Okay, and cell division comes in the form of a process called mitosis. In certain cells of your body, that process is called meiosis. We'll learn about those in a later chapter. Okay, so you can grow by cell enlargement or cell division. Next thing, all living things have some definite developmental stages. So as you go through life, there will be stages to your growth. You could think of a human as an infant, then you're kind of like a toddler, right? And then you're, I don't know, maybe like a teenager, then an adult, right? And then a senior citizen. There's developmental stages that you go through. Think about insects, they have eggs, they have larvae, they have pupa, they have adults, right? There's developmental stages that all living things go through. So that's what I put here for your example. All right, next thing. All living things must respond to stimuli, right? If you don't respond to a stimulus, you are not alive. What is a stimulus? Honestly, it could be anything. It could be a sound. It could be a smell. It could be something that you see. It could be something outside the body. It could be something inside the body. It is something that is meant to trigger a response. So, if you got that grumbling in your stomach and you're kind of like, gosh, I wonder what that is. I don't know. Maybe I'm hungry. If you don't respond to the feeling of hunger, right, eventually you'll die. Now, to be perfectly honest with you, you can go more than 3 weeks without eating, but who wants to do that, right? So that's what it means to respond to a stimulus. Okay, all living things respond to a stimulus. Okay, next thing. All living things must adapt or evolve to their environment. What does it mean to adapt or evolve to your environment? Well, let's look at that. To adapt means over the course of your life, you're going to make subtle changes in the organism itself, or maybe you and your family line. Now, these subtle changes will take place literally over generations, and the idea is that as those generational changes occur, the individual family line becomes better able to cope with the environment, okay? As that organism changes and becomes more and more distinct, the accumulation of adaptations is ultimately what we define as evolution. So living things can and should actually adapt to their environment. All right, so those are all of the characteristics of living things. And at the end of the day, if you don't have all of those, you're not alive. So let's talk about a time period in our history where people didn't really actually understand where life came from. I'm going to give you a few slides on some scientists that we'll talk about again later, just to kind of explore this issue. So at a point in our history, people actually believed in this thing called spontaneous generation. Spontaneous generation literally means life comes from non-living things. How crazy is that? Like they actually thought that, fish were somehow born out of the mud at the bottom of a pond, or maybe mice were somehow hatched out of little grains of wheat or corn that was held in a basket in their, hut or home, and that flies were somehow born out of decaying meat. Now, you and I, even with no knowledge of biology at all, would probably look at those types of thoughts or ideas and go, "You guys are crazy." Like, who would believe that a fish is born out of the mud? But you're way, way, way smarter than those people back in the 15th, 16th century. You've got a lot more science under your belt than they ever did. So they didn't really know where life came from. They just knew that, hey, it rained, there's a pond, and whoa, there's fish. So I don't know where the fish came from. They must have popped out of the mud. So there were some scientists that actually studied this idea. I'm going to give you their names and real quick what they did. And like I said, we'll talk more about them in another lecture. We're going to start with Franscesco Redi. He was an Italian doctor in 1660. And basically, he challenged this idea of spontaneous generation. The idea that he was looking at was, do flies actually come from decaying meat, or where? Like, where do they come from? Flies? I don't know. So he did an experiment by taking jars, and he put chunks of meat in the bottom of those jars and left some of the jars open and sealed some of the other jars with little strips of burlap sack. Left those sit out on his lab bench for about a week. Came back after a week, and you can imagine what it smelled like in there. But when he looked at the meat in the jars that were open, no lid, man, the meat was covered with maggots, worm-like baby flies. And then on the jars that had the lids, the burlap lids, no maggots were on the meat. They were only on the lid itself. So that told him that, you know what? Hey, maggots aren't actually being born out of the meat. Maggots are actually coming from flies. The flies, when they couldn't come in contact with the meat, they just laid their eggs on the burlap lid, and that's where the babies were hatched out, right? So this disproves spontaneous generation for big stuff, like flies. But that wasn't the end of the story. Next comes a guy by the name of John Needham. John Needham in 1748, he's a Scottish scientist. He actually provided evidence that might seem to prove or support spontaneous generation. He did an experiment with beef broth. It's kind of like soup with no noodles, okay? And he put the broth in a flask and boiled it for a short time and then put a cork on top, right? Well, every time he did it, he noticed that bacteria always grew in his beef broth. And so he thought, well, I guess spontaneous generation, that's a thing, because, I boiled the stuff, I put a lid on it, and there it goes, the bacteria is growing. Well, John Needham, we found out later from another scientist, made some mistakes, right? Let's talk about that guy. The scientist that disproved what John Needham did is Lazzaro Spallanzani. Lazzaro Spallanzani is an Italian scientist. He challenged Needham by repeating Needham's experiments, but making two changes. He boiled the broth longer, and instead of using a cork, which we later found out was porous and let air go into the flask, he literally melted glass over the top of the flask so no air could get in. Lo and behold, Spallanzani's experiments showed no microbial growth. So you think this would be a dead deal now. Everybody, understands, okay, no spontaneous generation. Well, people didn't agree with Spallanzani either. They basically just said, okay, well, that just means as long as air can't touch the broth, that, hey, nothing will grow. There must be something in the air. They called it a vital force in the air that imparted life into the beef broth. Again, you and I shake our heads and go, nope, that's crazy talk. Well, Louis Pasteur was the scientist that actually disproved all that. 1861, French chemist Louis Pasteur proved once and for all spontaneous generation was false. Basically, he repeated the experiment by Needham and Spallanzani, but he changed his flask one more time. He took the neck of the flask and he extended it out in a big, long S-shaped curve, right? And then he didn't put a cork at the end of the flask. There's pictures of it in your book, right? The reason this is different is that air could actually travel all the way up the S-curved neck and touch the broth and then go all the way back out. But because the neck was so long and so curved, the air moved really, really slowly. So slowly, the air couldn't even carry the finest particles that were floating in it. As the air moved in the first curve, all those particles settled out. And eventually, by the time the air got to the beef broth, it was, for lack of a better way to put it, sterile. Okay. So Louis Pasteur's flask sat for days, weeks, and nothing happened to the broth. But man, that first curved neck, it was nasty. It was black, hairy looking, and gross. Like all this stuff was like settling out at this one spot. So Pasteur said, look, guys, there's no like magic force in the air that is causing, the broth to spoil or life to get started. It's this stuff right here in this little curve that's doing it. Let me prove it to you. So he took his flask, he tipped it over, the broth came down, touched that gross first curve in the neck, he stood it up, and within a matter of hours, his beef broth spoiled. Louis Pasteur ended the debate over spontaneous generation and basically proved what we now call biogenesis. And that's the idea that life comes only from other living things. Okay, gang, so that takes us to the end of the story in terms of the characteristics of life and the scientists who proved it. See you next time.